Greetings. I am Captain Kevin Smith, and this is video number 3 in the series of videos that we're doing entitled Critical Decision Making. The purpose of this video is to support a number of projects that we have ongoing and to address ourselves to the concepts and the best practices associated with critical decision making. Now, in the video number 1 and 2, we talked about what that means, what critical decision making means, and why it's important in our lives, particularly in our business lives, particularly in our vocation, things that we do for a living, of course, but also in our private lives or in our recreational lives. We may encounter situations even there that would require us to engage in critical decision making. This video is about the big picture, so this is really how we start to think seriously about critical decision making, how to do it, and why it's important that we do it well. So the big picture is, in fact, a discussion of a real life situation that I was involved with. This situation or this problem scenario actually did occur, and so I'm giving you, the audience here, a first-person account of this rather amazing story that actually occurred, and it occurred within a particular industry. Now, like I said, I'm Captain Kevin Smith, U.S. Navy retired, and my experience, we'll talk a little bit about my experience and how I got involved in this big project that required us to solve a very serious problem facing the whole industry. And the industry was the airline industry. Now, I started out as a naval aviator, and I was dealing with issues related to air combat for many years. And then when I retired from the Navy as a captain, I went to work for the airline industry as an airline pilot and also as a problem solver, as it turns out. How I exactly got into that, that's kind of a long story. But anyway, so as it turned out, I was involved with problem solving across the board. First problem that I encountered as a young naval aviator was the issues related to aerial combat. I had to deal with that in a meaningful way, and eventually as I got more senior as a fighter pilot, I had to teach these skills to younger pilots just entering the pipeline. As an airline pilot, after I retired from the Navy, went to work for the airlines, and as an airline pilot I flew all large transport airplanes all over the world, and also got involved with some advanced pilot training initiatives. So the big picture then relates to what we call complex adaptive systems. All right, so the challenge before us was that the the situation that we were encountering involved a complex system. We had to make it adaptive. It was not adaptive. And this complex system was, in fact, related to airline pilot training. So the big problem that we were confronted with right off the bat was how do you make this rather complex system adaptive so it can be responsive and be continuously meaningful during the course of its life. We had to optimize the performance of man-machine systems, if you will, human and machine systems, if you like that term better. We had to optimize performance. Now, the industry, as I mentioned, this was in the mid to late 1980s. The industry was actually in crisis. And the crisis was caused by a rising accident rate, which was inexplicable, and nobody knew exactly how to deal with it. A blue ribbon panel was put together, empowered by the President and the Department of Transportation, and they came up with a number of recommendations because the industry was not doing well operationally, and one of the major recommendations was to go ahead and update, improve, and modernize airline pilot training, and I was involved with that initiative. So, like I say, the airline operational performance was degraded in many areas, and safety was not good, and so we were asked to basically solve the problem, and most people got out of our way. There were some efforts to influence our efforts. I was the chairman of the Training Integration Task Force that was chaired at the national level through the Department of Transportation and the Air Transport Association. And so we began to look at this thing from a systems perspective. And so the Advanced Airline Pilot Training Initiative was started, and I was on the ground floor of that initiative along with a few others. Now, there was 3 areas that we looked at, and we can see this, or I should say I'd like for us to see this as a general category that would affect all industries, not just the airline industry. But the 3 pillars of safety that we were interested in was the technical stuff, the psychological, which dealt with human psychology, and the operational, which was a rather, at that time, a rather ill-defined body of knowledge. It wasn't a focus of serious attention up to this point. But then it became a focus of serious attention, and rightly so, as a result of our efforts. Again, the 3 pillars of safety was technical. All things technical had to do with the big mechanisms that we call modern airliners and the various technical aspects of that. Psychological, there was some early efforts to deal with the psychological aspects of human performance, and so we looked at that, and we decided that was an important component of the performance equation. And then we noticed something that was completely missing. And what was missing was the operational side of things. We thought that was being covered, but it was not being covered in any meaningful way. And And so what we did then is we began to consider such things as full mission training, or to look at things from the full mission system perspective. And that's where we spent a lot of our time. And as it turns out, that's where much of the improvements came from. Again, the technical things like aircraft engines, wings, electrical systems, you name it. And there's all kinds of things associated with the modern airliner, and it's a technical marvel. There's no question about that. So the technical side we looked at, that was being handled pretty well. There were some things about it that we improved and we modified, but the technical side was doing pretty well. The psychological side, there was some initial efforts. Initially, this came out of the University of Texas at Austin. They did some initial work and studies, and so we adopted some of their stuff, and we added to it some of the other things that were going on in the psychological arena, and that proved to be quite successful. But the operational side was the thing that we spent most of our time on, because it was not being handled very well. What we were doing is we were training airline pilots in pieces and components of the mission, but we were not doing full mission training. And that turned out to be a big problem that we had, and that was a huge mistake initially. And now, when I say mistake, I'm saying that I'm not casting any blame. I mean, the industry was doing the best it could. But in terms of things that were ill-conceived, or things that were not considered to be important, but were things that we should have or we could have done better, that's what we're talking about. So the operational side was particularly important. And what we did then is we incorporated full mission training within the curriculum, within the courseware. Full mission training became our central focus. So airline pilots were now being given the big picture and how to operate within the context of the big picture. Complex adaptive systems, of course, and here we have kind of a fascinating aspect of this effort, which was that we were dealing with a complex training system. We had to make it adaptive, which we did, but also the human-machine broad system was also a complex and adaptive system. Now, it was complex, of course, and it was operating in a complex environment, but it wasn't particularly adaptive, and that was the thing that we had to do. We had to make the training system and the human-machine system that was operating, or the operational system, so we have the training system and the operational system working together. Both of those things had to become more adaptive, which was our major focus, and that's what we did. So complex adaptive systems, they were complex, but we had to make them adaptive, or more adaptive than they were. They were not particularly adaptive. And so we had to do that, and that was not something that was easy to do. We had to figure out a lot of ways to do it, and a lot of innovation went into this effort across the board. Many people contributed to it, and many innovations came from many great people that I worked with. And so innovation was the key. A complex training system, of course, we had that mostly in place in terms of the physical attributes, but how to make it adaptive and how to make it responsive to the modern operational environment, that was the key. Complex adaptive systems, of course, is a very important thing, and it's becoming the subject of quite a bit of study, and the more we know about complex adaptive systems, the better off, and that is going to be one of the things that we're going to be talking about in later videos and later initiatives that we have under the heading of critical decision making. The lessons learned. I'm going to highlight some of the lessons learned from this initiative, which turned out to be quite successful. All the airlines now in the United States are using this kind of training program that we put together back in the early 90s. The first thing, the lessons learned, is that we have to use systems level thinking. We cannot just fiddle around with pieces of the system one at a time and expect to be successful. We can't do that, and there's a lot of theoretical reasons why that doesn't work and why that can't work. So systems thinking is very important. Also the instructional system had to be event driven, and that's particularly important, and that is different than data driven. So the instructional system, in order for it to be adaptive, it had to be an event driven, or it had to correspond to an event driven model. So we had to create the event driven model to make sure that the instructional system was in fact adaptive. Now, also the operational system that we were trying to optimize in terms of the airliner and the flight crew, that had also to be event driven. It was previously a data driven approach. We were using the data driven model, and that didn't work. We had to redefine that completely from the ground up. But we had to make it an event driven model and in an event driven hybrid system. And that's what we did. We did that by incorporating within the curriculum these full mission scenarios. And the full mission scenarios were all event-driven scenarios. And that was the major thrust of our training initiative for the airline pilots, was to immerse them within the full mission scenario and see how they performed, and to help them optimize their performance with respect to mission success. The full mission training required us to create a mission statement, and full mission training became the central focus of this new initiative. And systems thinking was extremely important. We had to go from traditional thinking to systems thinking, and that was very, very necessary. We kind of stumbled in the beginning of this because we didn't quite understand that until we realized that we were not making very much progress, and then systems thinking helped us get out of this dilemma. And of course, it was an event-driven effort across the board. So these instructional scenarios had to be event-driven, and we had to be able to optimize performance under less than ideal conditions. And that was the whole purpose of the initiative. And of course, that's going to work in all industries. It doesn't necessarily have to reside exclusively in the aviation industries. It turns out the medical industry, or medical industry, and a lot of the surgeons are using many of the same things that we developed in this program. I know that many of the doctors, in fact, most of the surgeons in this country are using some of the features that we developed in this initiative. That completes this video, which is the video number 3 in our series of videos dealing with critical decision making. Thank you for listening and watching.